Christopher Hitchens joins us this morning, and we're here to talk with him about his views about Iraq. Well, you're talking to us on a week, of course, when the constitutional process is delayed, but this morning the AP ran a story of some encouragement that they think that they're going to break through and reach compromises, and also the day after some horrific bombings again in the country. What's your feeling about where all this stands right now, the policy?
Well, I haven't seen the AP report. I'm pleased to hear about it, but I know that the two examples you give are both essentially accurate, and they couldn't point a bigger contrast. In one case, Iraqis are trying to create not just a federal system that satisfies the needs of the differing ethnic and communal factions, but also a democratic federalism, an extraordinary thing even to be trying in that area. And on the other side, you have the most savage Islamist nihilism, largely, but not exclusively, inflicted by foreigners, by imports to the country, who would rather see Iraq bleed to death than to see this experiment succeed. So I think it's as simple as that, and one has to keep on asking people as politely as possible, which side are they on? And I've chosen mine, and I hope you can guess which one it is.
In fact, a column that you wrote earlier this month, there was one line that caught my attention, which says that supporters of the war, I'm paraphrasing, must come to grips with the possibility of failure.
Of defeat, yes. And I think there's a tendency in argument for people to line up like this, those of us who think the regime change in Iraq was necessary, stressing the good news, and those who don't like it or don't like the president or don't think he told the truth, stressing the bad. In fact, I think it should be the other way around, because the possibility of defeat is such an awful one. You have to imagine the sort of people who'd be running Iraq. A country of that size and importance, where we've made so many promises, taken over by bin Ladenism. We should be looking down that gun barrel all the time and realizing what the stakes are.
Now, what do you make of the what seems to be rising anti-war sentiment in this country, epitomized most visibly by Cindy Sheehan and the hundreds or thousands of supporters in demonstrations all around the country last night, also by a new poll that I have here it's reported in the Washington Times this morning that suggests, I probably can't reach it, the president's approval rating is down to 43%. And a front page story in the New York Times, bad Iraq war news has some in GOP worried over the midterm elections.
Well, in order, those three, I mean, I think that the anti-war forces have made a mistake by adopting this Sheehan woman and letting her become their spokesman. She's not just a grieving mother. This is not just a sort of soft-centered, August human interest sob story. I mean, I published in Slate a couple of days ago what her real political opinions are. By the way, I must say, for my own profession, I think it's scandalous that this was not done before. She's written a long screed in which she says that her son was killed in a war organized by a Jewish cabal, secret Jewish government within the United States. He was murdered for Israel. And she said openly that she thinks the root cause of terrorism in the world is the President of the United States. Well, I think that's a disgraceful position. And I think she should have been called on it before I called her on it. And when she was finally asked about it, she lied and said she hadn't made this statement. So she's a hysterical fabricator in two ways. One, she's come up with this wild confection of partly MoveOn.org, partly David Duke opinions. Both of these forces, by the way, have come out and supported her. And second, she's not been honest enough to admit that those are her opinions. So I think it'll be over quite soon, the Sheehan thing. I think it should be exposed as a fraud. And I think those who've tried to make an emotional martyr, moral blackmail out of her will regret it. Or anyway, they should be made to regret it. And the profession, our great profession of journalism, should stop being a megaphone for such a person and just handing her the mic and saying, just say what you like, we have no questions.
And on domestic politics?
Well, I sometimes put it like this. If the president and the US administration were good at making their case about Iraq, I could take a lot of time off. I mean, things are so bad that, I have to come on and try and explain why I think it's worth fighting for. I think they've done a generally very bad job of doing so. And that's partly because there's a great split within the administration about this. I mean, if the administration makes a claim, in my opinion, a correct one, say, about the connection between Saddam Hussein and bin Ladenism, or Baathism and bin Ladenism. Someone from the CIA will tell the New York Times, and it'll be on the front page, no, we don't think that's true, so that the whole case gets undermined by division within the government. They've almost given up, in fact, trying to make the case. All that Bush can think of to say is to say, well, we have to stay the course. And though I agree with him about that, and I've never heard anyone make a persuasive argument that we should abandon Iran, it suffers from diminishing returns. And many Republicans were not in favor of this really to begin with. They could have done without this. Indeed, I mean, Bush himself was elected on a program of lifting the sanctions, first time, lifting the sanctions on Iraq, not using American troops for nation building or humanitarian purposes. In some ways, a lot of the right wing don't have the stomach for doing this.
Phone lines are right beneath me on the screen here in Washington for our radio viewers, 202-737-0001. If you support the president's policy in Iraq, if you support the Democrats, 202-737-0002. And our line for independents, 202-628-0205. As you know, we called you specifically this morning because yesterday we had Harold Meyerson on, Washington Post columnist and also the editor of American Prospect. And you are depicted, I don't know what you think of their characterization of you on the cover.
I haven't actually seen the photograph. I read the article.
There you go. That's what their artist thinks.
Well, fortunately, the viewers can judge for themselves. I mean, it's not bad. It's perhaps a little more hog-like than I actually am.
And they didn't get the beard, but
well, that's optional, of course. I only grew that in Iran recently to try and make myself less conspicuous.
With Charles Krauthammer, Bill Kristol, and Tom Friedman as pundits who are responsible for what he sees as a failed policy. He named you, spoke about you, and we want you to have a chance to respond to his criticism. Here's one of the comments he made yesterday.
He has looked at the war through a lens of actually his long associations with some Kurdish insurgents against Saddam Hussein's regime, and some of the secular left in Iraq, and I think rightly he is identified with them and has seen this as a contest between them and Saddam Hussein, and so he took sides, and once he took sides, that was it. The practical consequences of the intervention were sort of beside the point. And he did something as well, which some folks coming out of a Marxist background do, which is said clearly history is on these folks' side. They are the force of the future.
Well, I must say that's a fairly decent summary of my position. Rather fair-minded, as is his article. There's an attempt to be sarcastic about it, but it's quite true. My position derives originally from solidarity with the Iraqi opposition to Saddam Hussein, the Arab and Kurdish opposition, who I thought had the germs of a democratic future in them. And in any case, we should be on their side, win or lose. Having in the past let them down, I do think, yes, that they, as for saying history's on anyone's side, one should be careful, but I think the United States is on the right side of history in the region now, after being on the wrong side several times. And there is a definite evolution towards democratic pluralism. You can feel it. You can see it in Lebanon. You can see it in Egypt. The people who are taking part in these movements have said to me that it was greatly helped, greatly forwarded by the removal of Saddam Hussein, by kicking out from the rulership of a keystone state in the region, a psychopathic, fascistic crime family. Mr. Meyerson is entitled to his view that I therefore think that none of the actual consequences are relevant. That's obviously not true, but I view them through that prism. Sure, yes, I do.
And in fact, on that point...
And I mean, I feel flattered that he's noticed. That's my motive. Those who say we should abandon the Iraqi and Kurdish Democrats and give over the country to bin Ladenism and Baathism and chaos, they're the ones who have all the explaining to do, not me.
Meyerson writes of you and the others he names that they subordinated the facts on the ground to their own ideological preferences and those of their allies within the administration, refused to hold the administration's conduct of the war and the occupation to the ideals that they themselves profess, or simply to the standard of common sense, abdicated their responsibilities as political intellectuals and more elementally as reliable empiricists. They were wrong, colossally wrong, about the single most important matter that can be put before the American public. Indeed, they were more than wrong. They ceased being intellectuals and became apologists.
Well, that, with respect, that appears to contradict what I just saw him say on the screen about my views and my motives. And I don't know to what you're referring there.
That is
which is this most important decision? Or what facts on the ground have I ignored? Does he specify any such thing? I mean, I'd have to take...
Abu Ghraib, Saddam Hussein, he lists those sort of things. That says here, things are in fact going well, the insurgency is dying, Abu Ghraib is not a scandal, Saddam Hussein did have ties to al-Qaeda, you just don't know it yet, and so on.
Well, to take those in order, there's nothing minor about the Abu Ghraib scandal, but Abu Ghraib is a lot better off, nonetheless, than it was 3 years ago, when it was a concentration camp and a slaughterhouse. I think I will only argue seriously with someone who acknowledges that that is true. I think most people hadn't heard of Abu Ghraib until recently, There's an undoubted connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda, and it's now been made material and open for all to see. Mr. Zarqawi, the leader of the so-called insurgents, who's not even an Iraqi, names his group al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, has sought and received bin Laden's blessing for this. Now, Mr. Zarqawi was in Iraq before this began, operating against my Kurdish comrades, among other things, and there was a very clear connection then between his group and the Saddam secret police. People who don't see this don't see it, but they shouldn't try and be sarcastic with me about it, because A, I know what I'm talking about, and B, I'm willing to look these facts in the face. The naive people are those who think that a confrontation in Iraq could have been avoided, that we could have just watched to see what might happen as Saddam went more and more crazy and as his lunatic sons either took power together or had a war between each other as to which of them it would be. That would have been lovely to watch. We'd have had to intervene later on much less advantageous terms. So, as I say, the naivety and self-deception comes from people who maintain still that Saddam Hussein was really no problem. One could not be more naive and deceptive than that.
Let's get to some calls for you, beginning with Jacksonville, Florida. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you for letting me on the air. Mr. Hitchens, I'm a fan of yours.
Thank you.
I got a subscription to Rolling Stone, and I tell you, if you ever left the magazine, I would cancel my subscription. So
I've never written for Rolling Stone, but are you sure you've got the right person?
Me, Vanity Fair. I'm sorry.
Ah, that's much better.
Okay, I'm very.
Oh, nothing against Rolling Stone, much better.
Okay.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Okay, I had two questions about articles that you wrote. One was about the Michael Moore movie, and one about the Ohio election. Okay, the first one about the Michael Moore movie is that when you wrote that article criticizing his movie, you went on a program, I think it was CNN, and you had a co-panelist, I think his name was Tormain. You know, he wrote for Rolling Stone magazine, that's who I was referring to. I don't know, he's an African-American, I can't remember his name.
That's okay, let's get to the question, though.
Okay, but he had made a comment that the part of the movie that affected him the most was the part where a woman's home was destroyed by the American army, and that he cried. I wonder if he was aware that during the Civil War, President Lincoln and General Grant authorized that entire cities be burnt to the ground in the South. And I also wonder if somebody made a movie on the Civil War in which they showed the destruction that the Union Army caused in the South, but didn't show anything about slavery, if people like Spike Lee would not be offended by a movie like that, and I suspect they would be.
Thank you very much.
It doesn't need a call for any comment from me. I mean, except, yes, I absolutely see your point. I'm not even sure that the film did really show the U.S. Army destroying anyone. So I mean, they showed a night raid of some soldiers entering a house, but none of the clips in that film can be trusted. Fahrenheit 9/11 is a tissue of lies from beginning to end.
Livonia, Michigan. You're next. Christopher Hitchens. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Thank you. You know, President Bush says that we're fighting these terrorists because they don't like our lifestyle, which may be true. But, you know, I think myself, the president's policies in this country, I would have to include him with the list of people that don't like our lifestyles, the way he's attacking Social Security and overtime pay, all the things that are traditionally good for our country. And so, you know, and he says you're with us or against us, but I'd like to know who is President Bush with, because I don't feel like he's with me. And I'm sorry, Mr. Hitchens, You know, I wish you'd realize a lot of people in my position don't get a voice, and thank God for Cindy Sheehan. Thank you. Bye.
Well, I don't agree with the president on quite a number of things. In particular, I don't like his piety, his religiosity at all, and his recent absurd statements about the non-theory that calls itself intelligent design would be a case in point. I don't think he said lifestyle, by the way, and I don't think that the forces of Al-Qaeda are interested particularly in overtime pay or social security either. What I think he meant to say was way of life or civilization, and on that point, the main point, he's right. This is an attack on the very idea of liberal pluralism and secularism on which our republic is based. And it is a deadly enemy, and it's good to be able to know an enemy when you see one. Now, the president seems to get this point in a way that a lot of liberals do not. So until that question's cleared up, I don't think you're entitled to introduce any old distraction and say, well, just because of that, I don't agree with him on the war. You have to let me know what you think about the first case, which you didn't. Though I suppose I can guess, because if you fancy Miss Sheehan and her antics, I'm presuming that you sympathize with her in saying that this war is fought for Israel and is run by a secret Jewish cabal within the administration, and that the President of the United States is the most significant terrorist in the world. And if that is your view, you ought to have had the courage to say so.
New Orleans, good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'm 100% against the war, and I don't agree with Mr. Hitchens' position at all. I think this war is totally 100% neo-colonialism. It's wasting billions of dollars that could be used for a lot of domestic purposes. And it's very, very funny that a lot of people say that we're fighting terrorism, but if you look outside the window, you don't see any other troops anywhere in the United States, anywhere near the United States. But if the Iraqis look out the window, if a lot of other people in different parts of the world look out the window, they have United States troops and planes, bombs, and ships surrounding their country. So who's really being threatened? I have never felt threatened by any terrorist, and particularly as an African American, I feel like this whole trumpeting of the idea of democracy is not legitimate, because under the guise of democracy in this particular country, we were made slaves for over 87 years of its particular existence, not to mention the colonial existence under the British Empire, and then the de facto factor of being disenfranchised for another 100 years under the whole name of democracy. If you ask most white people when this country became a democracy, they would say from the beginning. So how can you say democracy is such a superior form of government when this country and other people in the world realize this, and they also realize that the Western powers, particularly Britain, and then later the United States, are responsible for much of the colonialism and the neo-colonialism around the world. So
Thank you, New Orleans. Let's stop it there.
Yes, I think I got his drift. Well, actually, he gives me a chance, with your permission, to waive my new book.
Okay, you're welcome to do
by
that.
Mr. Thomas Jefferson, which
I will put it under the camera here.
Available for fine bookstores everywhere, and does have quite a long discussion about the moment at which, at the founding of the Republic, Mr. Jefferson tried to write into the Declaration a denunciation of slavery, and I've reprinted what he actually said, what that would have said if it had been in, and I give the reasons which you can, I'm sure, sir, guess why it was struck out. I mean, largely to placate the southern colonies, states to be, Georgia and the Carolinas, but also the slave traders rather than slave holders in New York. And I go on at some length about what things were like on Mr. Jefferson's plantation as well. So believe me, you're not talking to someone who would have given that naive reply if you'd asked me the question. For the rest of what you said, it seems to me it would be true. That's to say, the prolongation of slavery and disenfranchisement would be true whatever our policy was in Iraq. I mean, would have been true, would remain as true as historically as you say it is. But it didn't seem to me that you made any real connection between that and our policy in Mesopotamia now, and do bear in mind that a lot of the people who opposed the war, like Mr. David Duke and Mr. Pat Buchanan and so on, members of the extreme right, who are not known for their sympathy for civil rights or the rights of minorities in this country. So I'm afraid that we probably disagree essentially on what the grammar of this argument should be.
Springfield, South Carolina, supporting the president.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens.
Good morning.
And it's a pleasure to speak with you. I spoke with you a number of years ago on C-SPAN, and we had a slight disagreement about religion. I know your distaste for religion, but I would like to commend you. Of late, you are one of the most clear-speaking and logical people on this subject that I have had the pleasure to listen to on any venue. And I applaud your move to common sense and logic, which might even be called a move somewhat to the right. But I'd like you also to address this point, and we've heard it by the man who just called, making what I refer to, and probably you've heard referred to before, as the dirty hands argument. And that is as follows. Because we, at some point in our past, have done something that was less than stellar, as all nations, of course, around the world have done, some much, much worse than we have done, that we're now not entitled to try to do the right thing in the cases where we can. For example, he was bringing up slavery. They make the argument, the liberals are so fond of making the argument that the fact that we at some point in the past made a mistake, or at some point in the past, as you yourself well illustrate with Henry Kissinger, do things that didn't make sense or maybe wasn't a good idea, that now we are forever damned and can never do something right. That's one point with the liberals. And the second point is, could you also address the way the liberals can't have a reasoned, logical discussion about this, as you are trying to do, but carry it to such extremes of where our presidents compared to Nazis, and you hear imperialism thrown around, when in fact, if we were in fact the Nazis, or we were Imperial Rome, or even British Empire, as you well know, we would never leave a country once we conquered it or taken it over. In fact, we'd now occupy most of Europe. We'd occupy most of Japan.
Thanks, Springfield. I'm going to jump in. We understand the point.
No, fair enough. I mean, I did write a book about Henry Kissinger and his foreign policy career, if you can call it that, that says that he should be charged, and if charged, would be convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I could probably tell quite a number of liberals and people on the left things that they don't know about crimes committed by the United States in the past, which would include Kissinger's betrayal of the Kurds, who he supported as the rope supports the hanging man in the 1970s, promised them support, made them risk their lives in an uprising against Saddam Hussein, and cut them off abruptly without telling them he was going to, leaving them to die on the hillsides. One would also have to include the period when Mr. Rumsfeld was going to Iraq and shaking Saddam Hussein's hand, ostensibly because we preferred him to the Ayatollah Khomeini, which there might have been a case for doing, but after that war with Iran was over, continuing to give him the sinews of war and letting him use them for genocidal purposes within the borders of Iraq itself. So it seems to me that these past crimes and blunders redouble our responsibility, redouble our responsibility to put that right, and to accept our responsibility to the people of Iraq and to the country, not try and dodge that, and so to speak, make good on it this time. It would be, my case would in fact, if you like, therefore be weaker if it wasn't true that our policy in the past has been so ill-founded and misjudged. I'm sorry, I've just remembered something that the gentleman before you said, the gentleman from New Orleans, I think. He said, I wrote it down, he said, I've never been threatened by any terrorist. I don't know, I can't quite think what he means by that. Does he mean New Orleans hasn't been hit yet? I live a long way from New York and Washington, so it doesn't affect me. I don't know, I wish I had him back on the line now, but I hope that it was noticed by others that that's what he said. That seems to be a very parochial and provincial and narrow view of the matter to me. Just because he hasn't been hurt by it does not mean it's not a problem.
Detroit, good morning.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say that Mr. Hitchens, because you are such a talented and intelligent individual, I believe that you are amongst the most vile of propagandists for this and apologist for this Bush administration, because I somehow get the feeling that you know that a lot of what you're saying is very much a lie. I believe, as someone who has followed the war from the very beginning, that you know that there was absolutely no need to rush into this war simply because of the sanctions that we had placed on Saddam Hussein, the no-fly zones that we had on him, and the weapons inspections regime that we had on this man. People can say that he kicked them out, but he let them back in, and Bush pulled them out. I believe that you know that much of what you're saying is, in fact, confusing the American people, the right-wing base of the Bush crowd. You, as a human being, abandoned your family, just like Rush Limbaugh is a drug addict. You are one of those vilest of Republican right-wing scumbags who simply does not serve this country well.
Well, I'm going to stop you right there as it gets ad hominem.
Well, no, ad hominem would mean that what he was saying about me, even if personal, was true, which it's not.
Well, the language at the end was...
But it was no. Well, no. Well, poor guy. I mean, I think that's probably made his day, and I think he may be the sort of person whose day is made by that kind of thing. I mean, of course, one's heard the arguments before that Saddam Hussein was in a box with sanctions and inspections and no-fly zones, and it would be nice in a way if that were true. But as we now know, the sanctions were turning into a racket, an oil-for-food racket in which those who were supposed to be distinguishing between the Iraqi civilian population and its needs and the needs of the regime and so on were trading openly and cynically with the regime and lining their own pockets and its. It was an oil for palaces program and an oil for corruption program. The no-fly zones were a very good idea, but all they could do was prevent the renewal of genocide. And when you say that we rushed into the war, most people, I think, would agree with me at least that the root cause of this current argument, the origin of this current argument, is whether or not it was correct to leave Saddam Hussein in power in 1991. I'm one of those who thought that the Bush administration was wrong to confirm him in power then, which means that this argument's been going on for more than a decade. I don't know how much of a rush you call that. Harold Meyerson, in his article that you just cited, refers to Iraq twice, I think, as a war of choice. In other words, he says, I'm wrong in saying that confrontation was inevitable. I simply don't understand how people can convince themselves that another confrontation with Saddam Hussein was not inevitable and in our future. But just on the term war of choice, I thought it's rather suggestive, because if I'm right and there is a latent confrontation coming with Saddam Hussein, if we don't indeed choose the time of it, then what we're saying is we'll let him choose the time and the place, which we always had up till then. He'd always been allowed to surprise us. Invade Iran, invade Kuwait, use chemical weapons in the north of his country, not his country, the north of Iran. Mr. Meyerson appears to be saying, since we opted to say, no, we'll stop this, we'll put an end to this regime now, we chose to do it, that's in some way a wicked decision. Well, that leaves him with the responsibility of saying, well, let's not choose it, and let's let Saddam choose. That is really a counsel of despair, and I think of masochism and almost suicide.
How important is the trial of Saddam Hussein and
No, it's very important. It's very important. I wish it had already begun. And there have been a lot of postponements and misunderstandings about it, but I think that it's essential that people who commit acts of the sort that he committed all his life be brought to justice in front of their own people, if we can't get them to an international tribunal. It's much better if they can be tried in their own countries. I would instance the case of Pinochet in Chile. It was very important that he was finally indicted by a Chilean court, that he'd been wanted by other courts and prosecutors in Europe. Very important that the Argentine generals, the same, General Videla particularly, were tried and jailed in Argentina. It's a pity we couldn't have put Slobodan Milosevic on trial in Belgrade, but His trial is covered regularly live on TV, and people in Serbia can watch it, and they used to admire him when he started off sort of bluffing and strutting, and now he's been just worn down by months and months, now years, of the presentation of more and more solid evidence, and the grin has been wiped off his face, and it's been a tremendous education for the people of former Yugoslavia. And so I can't wait for this trial to begin, and I have one trivial reason why I can't wait for the evidence to be presented, because I've seen some of it. I know what it's going to look like. It will stop people saying to me, okay, I agree Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. That's always the dead giveaway statement. It always shows you're talking to someone who has no idea about Iraq at all. If they had the faintest idea of the sorts of things that he was responsible for, they wouldn't be content with saying, okay, he's a bad guy. You're dealing really with the face of evil here, with a regime that was run by professional sadists, and where the psychopaths were in charge of the asylum. And the wounds in Iraq are so deep and so ghastly and so horrible, and it's so little understood that I'm really impatient to see justice being done, and very proud to be a supporter of the policy that put him in that jail and will put him in that dock.
Houston, good morning. You're on the air.
Hi. I'm so glad to be able to talk to you. I'm really very nervous. But I'd like to know, have you ever read the book by Janae Davis called The Third Terrorist? The foreword is written by David Shippers, who successfully prosecuted the impeachment case against Clinton in the House of Representatives. She names names, talks about the front companies, and also lists eyewitnesses. Some of them, all of them, of course, are Oklahoma City residents, and I don't know why none of them have never called in. Have you ever read the book?
No, and I didn't know till you just made it clear that what the book was about. It's about Mr. McVeigh.
You are absolutely correct about Saddam Hussein. According to this book, you need to read it, Mr. Hitchens. It will make you more resolved about your opinions today.
And it's called The Third Terrorist? The
Third Terrorist by Janae Davis. She was just an NBC affiliate reporter working for the NBC affiliate. And, David Shippers, it was a former federal career prosecutor.
Yes, I know about Mr. Shippers very well, yeah.
Well, he wrote the foreword to the book. America needs to read this. They need to know about it. They need to dispel the lies that have been told over and over about the president, his motives, why we went to war in Iraq. I can't believe after 9/11 that Saddam Hussein wasn't the first person they thought of.
And may I ask you, in the book, who does she cite? Who does she make the case for as the third terrorist?
She lists names. There's one named Saddam. His name is Husseini. And I gave the book to my aunt. She read it, and my brother. As many people as I can tell about this book. Please, America, go out and read it. Okay. Buy it and read it.
Thank you. Is there enough there to comment on?
Yeah, I think maybe there is. I'm guessing what the thesis of the book would be, so I shouldn't comment on that. But there still is a man named I've just forgotten his first name. Mr. Yassin, anyway, is his name. And he was the man who mixed the chemicals for the attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. Where the plan was to collapse one tower and make it fall into another one. He mixed the explosive for this. Was caught, apprehended by the FBI, incredibly given bail because he was a cooperative witness. After admitting to having done this, skipped straight to Iraq, which is a country it's not that easy to get into, by the way, or out of. That wasn't at that point. You can't just go. But was let in and was sheltered by Saddam Hussein ever afterwards. The most wanted man in the World Trade Center case, and you still hear people saying there's no connection between Saddam and the Muslim jihadist terrorists. I mean, in the face of the plain evidence that it was a very warm and tender relationship. Mr. Yassin is still at large, by the way. It was thought he might be captured during the intervention, but he just got away. Well, he's still got a big price on his head.
Torrance, California. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question and an answer. The question is, why is the USA losing the PR battle against a murderous psychopathic lunatic who lives in a cave? And my answer has to do with the fact that we humans think in terms of metaphors or frames. The metaphor that we have, Americans principally, of occupation is a benign one, the occupation of Japan and Germany. The metaphor that Middle Easterners have of occupation is that of Israel occupying Palestine. May I have your comment, please?
Well, yes, occupation is supposed to be neutral as a term. It's a legal term, actually, but obviously it's acquired different connotations in different ears. Just to say the word collaborator now doesn't mean quite what it used to mean before the Second World War. All it means is someone with whom you cooperate, but you know, it sounds different. If you take the two examples you just offered me, Israel doesn't, in a sense, occupy the West Bank. It claims the West Bank. I mean, or some of its ideologues do. They say this is already Israeli territory because it's mandated for us by God. Slightly different proposition from saying we will have to send troops to garrison Japan for a while until the country is rebuilt, and then we'll leave. I think technically now our presence in Iraq is not defined any longer by the UN or any other international body as an occupation, because it's given way to a democratically elected constitutional government which has pro tem invited the United States to, and Britain, other members of the coalition, to keep their forces there. So they're there, in theory, at the request of the Iraqi government. And it's a sure thing the United States doesn't want to own Iraq, and nor does it say that God gave us its territory. So I don't know if that helps to resolve any of the linguistic confusion.
Anderson, Texas, good morning.
Morning. Good morning, Mr. Hitchens.
Good morning.
I really enjoyed your earlier work, Mr. Hitchens, but I've kind of observed your writing and I believe really that you tried to get ahead of the curve in some respects, especially in regards to some of your work on people like Dr. Kissinger, for instance. And you know, you're kind of affiliated now with the group of what we might refer to as odd fellows for yourself. You know, many of the former Nixon team, for instance, Rumsfeld, et cetera. I saw a thing on the History Channel where they were showing clips of Rumsfeld speaking in his former capacity as a spokesman for the Nixon war machine in Vietnam, and his kind of evasive, arrogant remarks were word for word with the little game that he's spouting right now, which I'm sure you would be amused about. But what I was speaking towards were the fact that in all of these nations that you referred to, and I wanted to point out Pakistan and the fact that, you know, it turned out after all of this that the greatest danger of all was coming from a Pakistani nuclear scientist who was indeed spreading nuclear death and doomsday through the world. He was a Pakistani. But my point is that in all these nations, you have a fanatical a group of right-wing, even in Israel, who will do anything to hold power, including destroying their own country and assassinating their own leaders.
All right, I have to jump in. We're almost out of time.
Well, I'm not quite sure which thread to pull on there, but if I may, I'll select the instance you gave of Mr. A.Q. Khan. You didn't name him, but that's who you must have meant, I think, who was a Pakistani nuclear scientist, father of, as they say, of the Pakistani nuclear project, who'd gone into business as a kind of nukes R Us Walmart, dealing in the technology and access to it with North Korea and with Libya, and potentially with other countries too, and perhaps with Iran. I would just want to point out to you, sir, and to anyone else who's watching, that we only know about Mr. A.Q. Khan for this reason. Colonel Gaddafi capitulated not long ago, went to Tony Blair and George Bush and said, I give up. I'm going to stop trying to build myself a nuclear weapon. It's too expensive. The game isn't worth the candle. I've been basically found out, and because of what he'd seen happen in Iraq. And all the fissile material, or attempts to shape it, all the extraordinary arsenal that was disclosed by him in underground facilities in the Libyan desert, is now under lock and key in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which I hope you'll agree is a better place for it to be. Now, that's a huge step forward for anti-nuclear proliferation policy. And it did, when we walked back the cat from that evidence, identify the AQ Khan network and help us shut it down. I maintain that a lot of the credit for that breakthrough goes to the decision to remove Saddam Hussein from power, to break the logjam in the region, because there were other pressures on Mr. Gaddafi to give up his own WMD program. But when he did decide to do so, he didn't go to the UN, didn't go to Kofi Annan, he didn't go to Jacques Chirac at the EU. He came straight to Bush and Blair and said, I'm giving up, I'm handing over. Don't tell me that that isn't a vindication of the policy of confronting dictators who cheat on weapons inspections.
We're out of time, but always appreciate you coming to talk to our audience. Christopher Hitchens, as we've said, writes for Vanity Fair, and he also posts a blog on slate.com, but you can find out where to find him on his own website, hitchensweb.com. And we'll remind you again that he has a book on a very different subject, the biography of Thomas Jefferson. It's part of the Eminent Lives series of Atlas Books, HarperCollins, and it is widely available in a bookstore of your choice. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Last segment of the morning is on a very different topic, and that is on the rising use of methamphetamine in the United States. This afternoon at 3 o'clock, we're going to show you a congressional hearing that has to do with this. We're going to show you a little bit of that in the break, and when we come back, Larry Naik, who is the executive director of the National Association of Counties, which has been very involved in the collection of data and formulation of policy on the use of meth in the U.S., will be here to talk to you about it.
This is actually the 9th hearing focusing on
thing even to be trying in that area. And on the other side, you have the most savage Islamist nihilism, largely, but not exclusively, inflicted by foreigners, by imports to the country, who would rather see Iraq bleed to death than to see this experiment succeed. So I think it's as simple as that, and one has to keep on asking people as politely as possible, which side are they on? And I've chosen mine, and I hope you can guess which one it is.
In fact, a column that you wrote earlier this month, there was one line that caught my attention, which says that supporters of the war, I'm paraphrasing, must come to grips with the possibility of failure.
Of defeat. Yes. And I think there's a tendency in argument for people to line up like this. Those of us.
Christopher Hitchens joins us this morning, and we're here to talk with him about his views about Iraq. Well, you're talking to us on a week, of course, when the constitutional process is delayed, but this morning the AP ran a story of some encouragement that they think that they're going to break through and reach compromises, and also the day after some horrific bombings again in the country. What's your feeling about where all this stands right now, the policy?
Well, I haven't seen the AP report. I'm pleased to hear about it, but I know that the two examples you give are both essentially accurate, and they couldn't point a bigger contrast. In one case, Iraqis are trying to create not just a federal system that satisfies the needs of the differing ethnic and communal factions, but also a democratic federalism, extraordinary killed in a war organized by a Jewish cabal, secret Jewish government within the United States. He was murdered for Israel. And she said openly that she thinks the root cause of terrorism in the world is the President of the United States. Well, I think that's a disgraceful position. And I think she should have been called on it before I called her on it. And when she was finally asked for it, she lied and said she hadn't made this statement. So she's a hysterical fabricator in two ways. One, she's come up with this wild confection of partly MoveOn.org, partly David Duke opinions. Both of these forces, by the way, have come out and supported her. And second, she's not been honest enough to admit that those are her opinions. So I think it'll be over quite soon, the Shian thing. I think it should be exposed as a fraud. Who think the regime change in Iraq was necessary, stressing the good news, and those who don't like it or don't like the president or don't think he told the truth, stressing the bad. In fact, I think it should be the other way around, because the possibility of defeat is such an awful one. You have to imagine the sort of people who'd be running Iraq, a country of that size and importance, where we've made so many promises, taken over by bin Ladenism. We should be looking down that gun barrel all the time and realizing what the stakes are.
Now, what do you make of the what seems to be rising anti-war sentiment in this country, epitomized most visibly by Cindy Sheehan and the hundreds or thousands of supporters in demonstrations all around the country last night, also by new poll that I have here it's reported in the Washington Times this morning that suggests, I probably can't reach it, the president's approval rating is down to 43%. And a front page story in the New York Times, bad Iraq war news has some in GOP worried over the midterm elections.
Well, in order, those three, I mean, I think that the anti-war forces have made a mistake by adopting this Shian woman and letting her become their spokesman. She's not just a grieving mother. This is not just a sort of soft-centered, August human interest sob story. I mean, I published in Slate a couple of days ago what her real political opinions are. By the way, I must say, for my own profession, I think it's scandalous that this was not done before. She's written a long screed in which she says that her son was